Judgment, or Judge Eyes as it was known in Japan, was a game released for the PlayStation 4 back in 2018 in Japan and 2019 everywhere else. The game later got remastered, and while it was still called just Judgment in the West, it was actually called Judge Eyes Remastered in Japan. The remastered version came out on PS5, Xbox Series, and weirdly Google Stadia and not PC in 2021, with it then later coming to PC in September of 2022. The game was released after Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise, but before Yakuza Like a Dragon. Considering it's a small thing, I'll start with talking about the remastered version. The game's original PS4 version ran at 30 FPS, allegedly, and I say that because the frame rates like to drop quite a lot. It also had a pinball minigame, which was a real game that you can actually buy on something like Steam, fun fact. However, the remastered version then removed that pinball minigame, probably because of licensing or something. The remastered version also has a slightly different Yagami model, although I think maybe possibly that it is a retroactive port of Yagami's model from Lost Judgment, but I don't know the exact differences or similarities, but he just looks different. Then on Xbox and PS5, it can run up to 60 FPS. The PC version, as you would imagine, can go above that, but the biggest thing with the remastered version of the game is the lighting of it. Some people think it's a big artistic change, but I don't think that's the case. The original game had a clearly intentional noir-esque color scheme, most notably at nighttime, which was even somewhat advertised on the back of the original box. It's not black and white, but it uses a lot of darker colors in the lighting for cutscenes and gameplay. So why would they have such a sudden shift for what is essentially just a port to better hardware? Well, as I said before, the original game liked to lag quite a lot. Considering 60 FPS was the main target for the remastered version, which was going to come out on Xbox Series S, which is a dogshit piece of shit bad console that holds every game developer back from making better looking games, they had to consider how to get it to run at 60 on that thing as well. Obviously, changing the lighting isn't going to suddenly double the frame rate, but I think that there would have been instances where the original lighting of the PS4 version may have slightly prevented the Series S and maybe even the PS5 and the Series X from hitting that 60 FPS target. I could be wrong, but in the original it seemed like they used a lot of lights when lighting up scenes, compared to the remastered version, which has a fair few less. You can see it in scenes where Yagami's face might be highlighted in the original with obviously several different in-game lights, but then in the remaster, he'll just have one flat light that lights up the shot. It was a good thing anyway, because at the very least the PS5 version of the game has such extremely rare frame drops, and even something like Judgment's Armon fight, which is infamous for making the PS4 run at 2 FPS, runs quite well on the PS5 version considering how horrifically optimized the fight is. The final thing worth mentioning is that this is the only game in the series available on Xbox that isn't on Xbox One. The reason for that is fairly obvious though. If they created an Xbox One version, they would essentially be creating a last-gen, next-gen version of the game, and probably thought that by releasing an Xbox One version alongside the PS5 and Xbox Series versions, that it probably would have caused a bit of confusion for consumers. But also because like 3 people have an Xbox in Japan, so I'm sure the Japanese publishers probably didn't really care about an Xbox One version. Now with that out of the way, let's talk about the gameplay. In this game you play as Takayuki Yagami, a detective that does about the same level of detective work as I do when I just hit inspect element on the website, because instead what he does most of the time is beat people up. The way you do this is with 2 completely new fighting styles, Tiger, the red one, and Crane, the blue one. Crane is designed to be used against groups of enemies, while Tiger is designed to be more one-on-one focused. But due to a lapse in judgment by the developers, Crane is quite bad and Tiger is quite infinitely better. However, the reason for that wasn't because Crane was designed poorly or anything like that, but instead it was just that Crane only got universal abilities like increased combo speed or Tiger drop, whereas Tiger got a lot of unique abilities such as Flux Fissure, which is insanely powerful. The game's level up system is also a bit different from earlier games. Whenever you complete certain actions like defeating enemies, completing story objectives, or completing anything on the completion list, you'll be given skill points which you then put towards unlocking abilities. There's no complex layout to any of these or catches with the SP2, so it's nice and simple. Anyway, towards the end of the game, you'd only ever swap to Crane to use its heat actions, or if you were doing some combo juggling thingy against bosses, so basically for a majority of your combat, you'd use Tiger. This was actually my biggest problem with the combat when I initially played it, and considering how small it actually is, it's quite a testament to how good Judgment's combat is. Yagami's got 3 brand new mechanics as well. Firstly, extreme heat's in this game, although it's called EX Boost, and when you activate it, you can string together a unique combo by mashing the heavy attack button. Crane and Tiger both have their own ones, and they're both pretty strong, but the main reason you do it is because they both have unique heat actions at the end of them. Crane hits 3 people, whereas Tiger hits just 1, which further emphasizes how they're supposed to be used. But then the the completely original mechanics are that when you sprint into a wall, you can jump off of it and do 3 different attacks depending on which button you push, or a heat action. You can also sprint directly into an enemy and leap over them, which allows you to again do different attacks depending on the button, and 2 different heat actions depending on whether you jump over the enemy's back or jump over in front of them. The animations were all the same for all the wall jump and leapfrog attacks regardless of which style you have, but Lost Judgment ended up adding more unique animations for each style. Then there was a unique mechanic to Judgment that is a detriment to players rather than a benefit. If you're hit by a boss's big strong heat move, or you're shot with a gun, your total health will be reduced, and it can only be healed by visiting a specific NPC or using a special item. This mechanic isn't really too big of a problem unless you're playing on the hardest difficulty, because otherwise it's just a bit annoying. They could have done a fair few things to make it a little better, but towards the end of the game you'll pretty much only ever get a mortal wound from enemies on the street, and once you do, you can just go heal anyway. Then another uniquely Yagami thing is that he can't use specifically any blades or guns. Equipment was completely removed for this game, so the only way you can get those types of weapons are from enemies dropping them, but even if you could use them, those types of weapons explode into a million pieces whenever an enemy drops them. Speaking of weapons, I think Judgment added back nunchucks because they weren't in Yakuza 6, but maybe they were in Kiwami 2, but I don't really know, I've never seen them in the game, and maybe this little feature was a thing in Kiwami 2, but what I'm getting at is, Yagami has a unique thing with nunchucks where you can swing them around and generate heat. He also has 2 separate heat actions with them depending on which fighting style you have, same with I'm pretty sure tonfas. Despite these special abilities and the fact that Yagami is a cool action kung fu dude, weapons are really hard to find in Judgment. They have select spawns in the open world, but in long battles or boss fights, the only weapons you'll typically find are stuff like bikes. Lost Judgment improved that a fair bit, with more enemies having weapons and adding in an ability to disarm enemies, but you still can't use Kali sticks. Nor could you in Judgment, even though you could in Kiwami 2, I don't know why. It's really a me problem though, because I just think Kali sticks are cool weapons thanks to abusing the shit out of them in Modern Warfare 2019, but you know, RGG Studio, could you please let Yagami use them in whatever new game he shows up in, please? Now then, with the combat out of the way, let's have a look at other parts of the gameplay that RGG Studio thought were so good that they featured it heavily in various trailers and other promotional material for the game. As Yagami is an inspect element detective, he does detective stuff. What that means is that he does very slow, long, and boring tailing missions that you always have to do, and I genuinely forgot how many tailing missions there were in this game until I did a second playthrough of the game. Then it came to PC and I wanted to try and run through it quickly for recording stuff, and that's when I remembered again, oh god, please no more tailing missions, I beg you. I dare say that there isn't a single person who played the game that didn't work on it who actually liked the tailing missions, because even if you do like tailing missions, these ones are quite poorly executed. What it boils down to most of the time is hiding behind a specified point, then going on your phone for a bit until you notice that they're far away, then you can just sprint up to them and do it again, because honestly that's more entertaining than doing them properly. The other detective things you do are little investigations. In all honesty, these aren't that bad because you can usually complete them in 5 seconds, but you have to go first person and look around for specific clues and whatever to proceed with the story. Sometimes the clue might be really hard to find, or other times you find the clue immediately, but then you have to actually look at something else first. There's an ability you can get though that will vibrate your controller whenever you look near an item, but I've brought this up in a video in the past and I don't really think they've ever done anything about it, but this ability hilariously does literally nothing if you're playing with a keyboard and mouse, or if you have vibration disabled in some way. Then finally you can do some lockpicking, and your standard lockpick is alright but a bit tedious sometimes, whereas a thing called the thumb turn bypass can suck my dick because it is incredibly slow and pretty easy because all you're doing is just spinning your thumbstick slowly in a circle. Overall though, the game has less to it than Yakuza 0, considering that it has less fighting styles, only one playable character, and just the one area. It also has less side content in comparison to Kiwami 2's very extensive list of minigames and side stories, but in comparison to Yakuza 6 and Kiwami 2's gameplay, it felt like that they perfected combat in the Dragon Engine. I remember thinking when I first played it that it was the best that they could possibly do because I honestly had no idea how they could have improved it, but boy did I end up getting shown everything that was wrong with Judgment a couple of years later. Now before I move on to the story, I'd like to quickly address why I skipped over Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise, but still felt the need to mention it. For those who don't know, Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise was a game that was released exclusively on the PS4 in 2018, the same year for Judgment in Japan and Kiwami 2 for the West. Typically in these videos, I've expressed how exclusivity creates some problems for spin-offs, but fortunately, as it's on the PS4, we've still got a few years before a physical copy becomes a million times the price that it should be, and before it gets digitally tossed into the digital sun. But before then, if you're on Xbox, that's very unfortunate for you, but hey, at least you can go play Halo 5. This game basically was like a reskinned mod pack for Yakuza 0 and Kiwami 1, as everything was very clearly copied from those games, and then they proceeded proceeded to edit many things, most notably the visuals, to make it more in line with Fist of the North Star media. In Japanese, the franchise is Hokuto no Ken, and so the Japanese name of this game was a very clever pun of that name and the RPG name, so it was called Hokuto ga Gotoku. Then on the other hand, the English name is so long that it almost is a competitor for Like a Dragon Guard, the man who raises them. I honestly don't think anything from this game ended up being applied to later games, besides maybe adding some knowledge and experience to the developers obviously, and one other little thing. When Kenshiro, the playable character, kicks at small enemies, he has the crane combo animations, which is weird because did Judgment take it from this, or did this take it from Judgment? The two would have been made at the same time after all. But anyway, the reason why I'm discussing this in this video on Judgment is for two things. For one, I want to pretend it never happened. Now I'm joking before anyone gets mad, because in reality I just felt that even though these videos are intentionally very short, the video on this would have been too short, as this game really didn't do anything significant for the franchise besides the reveal trailer of the game. It made it seem like it was gonna be something set in the Yakuza universe, but then they added a very funny little "Omae wa mou shinderu" reference, and suddenly it was Fist of the North Star. Anyway, that trailer was significant as it was also the first appearance of a very different looking Ichiban, but as you may know if you've played Yakuza Like a Dragon, this was during the meth arc of the game, so this definitely happened and was all real. But the other reason as to why this is in the Judgment video was this was the first RPG game since the first game to include an English dub, but unlike Yakuza 1, it was the first game to allow players the choice of playing it in English or Japanese. As I'll discuss in a bit, Judgment then carried that tradition, and it proceeded to then work its way into Yakuza Like a Dragon, Lost Judgment, and now Gaiden in November, and Infinite Wealth next year. The English dub of the North Star game was very good, with good casting and very good direction. Then there was the Japanese dub, which was what I played the game in, which was intentionally casted in a way that every character in the game would be played by an actor who was previously a character in an RPG game. Kenshiro is Kiryu, your main pals are people like Date, Yuya, Kashiwagi, Shinada, and Makoto. The villains are people like Shimano, Majima, Nishiki, Morinaga, Ryuji, and Junki-Han. And the narrator, who I swear I'm remembering this correctly, says like one sentence, is Akiyama. Now then, this game is definitely the worst thing RGG Studio has ever made, and of all the games I've ever been in my life, which has been like thousands at this point, none have ever made me physically groan in pain more than this one. Just because I don't like it doesn't mean no one else is allowed to. Don't let my opinions determine yours, because I can definitely understand people that like it. It's got the fundamentals of a Yakuza game with a superpowered twist, and as I've heard from many people, is one of, if not the best Fist of the North Star game ever made. The soundtrack, as you would expect, is very good, with a particular favourite of mine being the final long battle theme, which is just such an incredible song. The composers are all these standout, incredibly talented people that have worked on the other games, but this game's soundtrack, along with Kiwami 2's, are the only two RGG games to have never received an official soundtrack release. Its side content isn't too different from the Yakuza games and is still enjoyable, but it is a bit lacking. There's a bar mini game that's quite fun and funny until you realise that you just have to do the same three things over and over again with no variation whatsoever, and there's also an arcade complete with a bunch of arcade games that you have to get lucky and find yourself, or you could just go launch Yakuza 0 or Judgment or something and play Outrun without the grind. There's a lot of tediousness and repetitiveness in this game, but there's also some stuff that's very cool, like some of the quick time events and boss fights, for example, or again, the super cool soundtrack. However, my favorite section of the game was the part where you're in the city, then have to go to a faraway point on the map to talk to a guy, then something's blocking your path so you need a thing, so you go back to the city, then you need materials, so you go back to the faraway spot to grab those materials, then you go back to the city to get given the thing, then you go back to the spot to break the blocks to then drive a needlessly curvy road to talk to a guy who says he can't help you and that you need to go back to the city. Then you go back to the city and just get given what you were looking for anyway, which is so awesome. Glad I got dehydrated in the desert for nothing. Then you faff around in the city for ages until eventually the game says, okay, fine, now we'll let you go do a long battle and fight a boss. And all of that, despite being summarized in a couple of seconds, takes like an hour, probably more. Well, would you look at that? Look, oh, we've got a special guest on today's video. Why don't you come on down and introduce yourself? Oh, yes, hello, thank you. I'm very grateful to be here. I am the lead game designer on Fist of the North Star Lost... Wait, what the fuck? Anyway, now that Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise had a dub, it showed that it was definitely a possibility for these games to continue doing them. So, Sega wanted Judgment to have one too. By adding an English dub, it expands the potential player base, which obviously means more people get to experience a phenomenal game, but it also means Sega gets more money, which being a company is obviously their main objective. I definitely know people who will literally refuse to play a game or watch a show or something just because they aren't speaking English, with their reasoning being stuff like they don't want to have to read subtitles the whole time, or they're like me and it's just because they're racist. For Judgment, there wasn't a single character from the actual Yakuza games who would be voiced in any of the story, as every character was brand new, so the creators of the dub didn't have to worry at all about casting actors to play pre-existing characters. The reason I bring that up is because the next game of Yakuza Like a Dragon did, but the next game game and this game and this game sequel all did a fantastic job with the dubs.
Who plays Yakuza games in English?
Is a common thing you'll see on the internet. I do, bitch, but I'm not really complaining because just like with the Fist of the North Star game, Judgment had incredible casting and direction, and typically the sort of people you do see hating on English dubs of Japanese media are people caught in the era of, say, the 2000s and earlier, where most companies responsible for dubs barely gave a shit, like the early days of Funimation dubbing Dragon Ball Z. But these days, actors and directors and whoever actually can appreciate things like games and anime from Japan as actual entertainment mediums, so they actually now give a shit about English dubs. There does still exist pretty bad ones, or situations where actors were given literally zero direction with anything, like in a game like Xenoblade 2, but fortunately with the dubs of Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise, Judgment, and the next two games in this series, they were all blessed with the opportunity of having good people that were responsible for them who put in a tremendous amount of effort. The actors they got were perfectly casted by Keith Aram, head of PCB Productions, alongside his wife Valerie, who is also a voice actor in Like a Dragon, fun fact, and they also did the casting for the next few games, as well as Gaiden and most likely Infinite Wealth next year. Keith Aram's worked on quite a number of games like the SMT/Persona franchise, the golden age of Call of Duty games, Titanfall,
Yeah, Titanfall!
Monster Hunter, Street Fighter 6 very recently, and Sleeping Dogs, which was the exact reason why Masato Arakawa in Like a Dragon was voiced by Will Yun Lee. You can tell just by the games he's done director stuff for that this man clearly knows good people and knows what he's doing. He was also working very closely with the localizers of the Yakuza games, who were also well aware of the weight of what they were doing, and together they made sure that they got the right people for the right things. You have some iconic veteran actors like Steve Bloom playing Higashi, Crispin Freeman playing Kaito, JB Blanc playing Matsugane, who by the way can do the most spot-on Australian accent I've ever heard from someone who isn't Australian, Jamison Price as Morita, Jeremy Lee as Mafuyu, and a bunch of other incredibly talented people. But then they have some relatively new talent like Joe Zija as Hoshino, and Ray Chase, who fun fact messaged me on Instagram once, yeah I know, crazy, who plays Izumida. Greg Chun, the guy who plays Yagami, wasn't exactly brand new to voice acting at that point, being even in the dub of Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise, but he always credits Judgment as his breakout role, as before then he didn't do all too much, but then after Judgment is now in like every game you'll play. The people handling the dub of Judgment also wanted to make sure that the characters whose faces were modeled after their Japanese actors received heightened attention with the casting choice. Genda's actor, Brian McNamara, does such a good job at portraying him to the point when I hear Genda in Japanese, I forget that he's actually a Japanese person and not an old American man. Kuroiwa was played by Matthew Mercer, who's an actor that started out as being mockingly a discount Troy Baker, but now he's actually just become Troy Baker too. Then there's Ayabe, played by Matt Yang King, who I genuinely cannot explain to you how good of an actor he is. I'm serious, this dude's amazing. Then finally, Hamura originally had his face based off of his actor, but due to some stuff I'll explain in a bit, he got his face changed, but they still whipped out another veteran actor to do an incredible job playing him, being Fred Tatasciore. Now all this English dub praise isn't at all to say that the Japanese dub is bad or that the English dub is a better choice. I personally prefer the English dub, but you're allowed to personally prefer whichever one you want. I will say though that the English team were very well aware of the tremendous expectations they were faced with when it came to doing a dub for this franchise, with so much precision required by them to be respectful to the very Japanese source material and adapting it in such a way that your average Joe English speaker understands everything, without betraying the original meaning. However, I certainly feel that they, just like with their localizations of Yakuza 0 and onwards, went above and beyond those expectations. But anyway, time to actually talk about the story, and it is by far the best story that this series has, and if I'm honest, I think it might be a while until they beat that record. For what feels like the first time ever, the main antagonist isn't some pompous businessman who desires power, or some Yakuza guy who desires power, or some corrupt cop who desires power. You get the point. Instead, it's a serial killer whose identity is completely unknown, and the game sets it up to have every single person you meet be a potential suspect, but as you start to narrow down more details of the killer, you're left with fewer and fewer people that it could be, like a classic murder mystery drama show. Then when you finally learn the killer's identity, you realize that the main villain is not someone who desires power in some way like I said, but is literally just a complete psycho who likes killing people. The killer gets given a nickname by Yagami, the Mole, as the murderer always gouges out the eyes of all of their victims. And throughout the game, there are several people who sort of look at your eyes and go, ooh, nice eyes, it would be a shame if I stole them and whatever. When the game finally does reveal the killer's identity, it's done in a scene which I won't show, but it is seriously done in such a masterful way. When the killer's identity is revealed, your list of suspects would be insanely narrow, then the game smacks you in the face with the truth, and once it does, everything makes sense. The pacing and timing of all the game's plot details are so well thought out, and for the first time in Yakuza history, it has actual proper foreshadowing that you wouldn't at all see in a first playthrough, but on a second one, you just wonder how you could have possibly missed it at all. Once again, not to spoil details, but the killer at one point pretty much comes up to Yagami and says to his face, "Hello Yagami, tonight is a very good night for some killing, wouldn't you say? Gee, I sure do like killing people and getting away with it. I gouge out people's eyes when I kill them. I'm the mole. And if you had no idea who the mole was, you wouldn't even realize that they just said that to you. The characters too, as always, add so much to the game's story, with fan favorite characters like Kaito being the big lovable man that he is, and characters that end up having fantastic character arcs that you wouldn't really expect, like Higashi. While I felt more emotion from the story of, say, Yakuza 0, I never felt more on the edge of my seat than when I was playing through Judgment. There still was some emotion in Judgment's story, but where Yakuza 0 made me cry, Judgment had my heart racing because I genuinely felt nervous about what was going to happen next. The only downside to the story is that there are some moments where the game essentially forces you on some compulsory side quests that don't really do much to the story, like for example a part of the game where Kaito meets up with an old mate of his who ends up being a manipulative bitch, and then Kaito and Yagami fight. Nothing really comes out of that though because it's never brought up again, but I mean I guess it's some more interaction with Kaito which you can never say no to. One last thing too in regards to the story was that the original actor for Kyohei Hamura was a man named Pierre Taki. Long story short, the actor underwent some controversy for doing drugs, so the English release of the game almost had to get delayed a little bit because they had to rework Homura's face and recast him in Japanese. I've never really listened to Pierre Taki's performance, but from what I've heard, he was apparently quite good, so it is a little disappointing to hear about what happened. However, the reason I bring that up is because Homura's new face is likely a backup face for the character. As early as Kenzan, the RGG devs have been getting famous actors to play characters, using their likenesses to portray the very same characters. Yagami is one such example, having his face modelled off of Takuya Kimura. But as some people may know, there existed a lot of beta content for Judgment in the game files of Yakuza Kiwami 2. Within these files, there contains some draft images for some cutscenes, some drafts for some evidence items, and a draft version of Yagami. This kinda points some evidence towards the fact that the developers will always have original designs of their characters before they cast an actor to play them, and in cases like Hamura, can be chucked in to replace them. That's why Judgment ended up not getting delayed, because they didn't need to create a completely new face for Hamura, as they would have already had one lying around. But anyway, the only reason I mention all of this is just as a little fun fact. And with that fun fact out of the way, it's time to mention the soundtrack, which I remember seeing around the time of the game being the newest release, so basically before Like a Dragon came out, that some people criticized the soundtrack for being too dubsteppy and electronic, and now this new step has more or less become what the soundtracks are now like. I don't really see people say it anymore, but I do think that people were just finding reasons to hate on the game because, to be honest, it's really hard to find something to complain about with Judgment. While I won't play them to save on some time for the video, all you really have to do is listen to 3 songs: My Own Style, Lambda, and The Flower of Chivalry, and those 3 songs alone are enough to show that this game still has the wondrous diversity that every Yakuza game has always had. Judgment definitely has one of my favorite soundtracks though, and with the work of someone like Jin Senbonmatsu, who only worked on Judgment, it shows the incredible talent of the people that they always get to work on the music for the games. But to summarize, the story is beyond incredible, the soundtrack is great, and the gameplay, despite having a couple of hiccups, was such an incredible experience. Overall, the game goes hard, and prior to September of 2021, I thought that they probably couldn't do any better. Now then, if you liked the video, feel free to gouge out the like and subscribe button's eyes, and become a member of the Yagami Detective Agency. And by that I mean my channel, but you know, only if you want to. Join me in the next video where I take a look at the most dividing game amongst the community, and the first of a new generation of Yakuza games, being Yakuza Like a Dragon. Also, enjoy a really epic sounding outro with not very epic footage because my capture card doesn't work on my Wii U.